Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Darren Shan reread video. This one is going to be my discussion on the saga of Larten Crepsley, Book 2, Ocean of Blood. So, we ended up the first book, Birth of a Killer, with Larten and Wester both temporarily leaving their vampire training under Seb and Niall to join the Cubs, join Tanis Yule, and basically experience their sort of kind of youth as vampires away from their kind of duties to the clan, their aims to be vampire generals. And the idea is that this is going to all be about just having a good time for, you know, a certain amount of time. I think the implication almost from Seba when he left them is that, like, you know, I'll see them again in like maybe 20 years and they'll have it completely out of their system. And so jumping into this book, there's a few interesting things about it. The first one is probably just that, like, Ocean of Blood and the whole, what the cover is. It doesn't really come back until the very last section of the book. This book is split into 5 parts. The first one was 4, if I remember correctly. And literally part 5 is the only one that is about the actual on the ocean bit. The rest of it is very interesting still, but it's very, like, it skips throughout the, you know, the greatest hits basically of Larten's life. And it's really noticeable here because in the previous book the main time skips were going between the parts, but in this one, even in between certain chapters in certain parts, we're also doing like, oh, and a few years later this happened. So like I said in the first one, it's that sense of we have to cover a character who ultimately lives to be like over 200 years old, and you're trying to cover the key moments in the character's life while also still telling a story that works. But because it's a prequel about this character, you also have that factor of most people reading this will already have a lot of context for what's going on here, so how much do you fill people in on details that they may already know? Do you just leave it out? Do you leave some of it in? So there's a bit of a balancing act to be done here about sort of those 3 things, and it's just sort of the general lore of this universe that people know, making a just good story for this Larten focused thing, and then it's sort of the kind of connection type stuff of it being a prequel as well. How much do you do there? And again, I think the balance is actually quite nice here, in that lots of references are made to characters that you know, but I think it all flows in quite nicely, and this is where vampires living to be quite old and them having like a relatively easy time traveling around the place means that, oh yeah, they just randomly encounter like Vancha over here, Arrow over here. Well, it makes sense because they're vampires. So that kind of comes in to make it like believable and not just like everything being connected for no real reason. Now, the main kind of plot of the book is, of course, Larten's kind of character arc here, and this was introduced in the last section of the first part, and so the first like 3/4 of this book are also about that very same thing. And it's basically the idea of Larten, as said in the back of the book, Larten must decide what kind of vampire he will be, and we saw that with him and Wester's decision to join the Cubs, and we're going to see in this book his return, but then also after a certain amount of time him wanting to leave again to be on his own, but for kind of different reasons, and he's struggling about what exactly it is that he kind of wants from life. Like it seems like Vampire General is something he wants, but we of course know that ultimately even that wasn't necessarily, from like the main series, the overall goal. So it's just him sort of becoming comfortable with himself ultimately, and so it's very much you know, the character here as well as the ambitions of what sort of a vampire he wants to be. And I liked it. I can see maybe some people might have a slight issue that, you know, the end of the first book was he leaves, and then just a relatively small way into this book he leaves again. And if you don't really analyze the character, you might feel that that's a little bit repetitive. But I do think it works for this story and what they're going for here, in that is meant to be a little bit of a case of, you know, when you do the prequel for the character who is the old master to the young character, and that was the Larten Darren dynamic in the main series, you kind of want the same thing for Larten here, to eventually get to the point where he is this very composed character who doesn't really tend to struggle with all of these things. Darren is the one who should be struggling with what exactly he wants to do and all these decisions. But this time we get to see Larten tackling that himself, that his life and him finding out what he wanted to do was a bit of a struggle. So let's jump into this here and some of the details of the story. So we jump straight in, and obviously it's them with the cubs, and I actually like that not too much focus is necessarily placed on this first section of the story. It's just keeping in mind the characters who are important to keep track of going forward. That Tanis Yule is a character who has had a bit of an influence on Larten, but given what happens here, it's like, is that him gone for good? Is he going to turn up later? Because he had a similar moment in the first book where Larten kind of has a minor interaction with him, but then he comes back at the end of the book, and then it seems like you're done with him here right at the start. Will he come back? And of course we sort of know he will, but you know, we'll keep that for the next few books. But basically it's just a little bit of a recap of like, okay, what's kind of happened here is that actually Larten was initially kind of not as comfortable with this lifestyle as Wester was. But at the start of this book, we sort of see that Larten's full on in on this. Like, he can do this if he wants to do it. He's now going by the like nickname Quicksilver, and is known as this real cool character because he is so skilled with his hands and so on, impressing people, and he has that kind of stage performance aspect to him as well. So that's cool to see at the start of the book. But the main thing, I think, before we get to the moment that sort of ends their time with the Cubs, is just the kind of time, like a couple of years passed with them doing this, and the humans are at war, and the Cubs just sort of basically overlook battlefields. They just stand there with umbrellas to protect themselves from the sun, and watch as humans fight each other. And then when night comes over, they like attack the kind of remains on the battlefield and have this kind of feast of blood. And it's pretty brutal. Like, the way it's described from like the outside perspective seems so ominous, like these two factions having this war where they're killing each other, but they just look up to the side and there's these just pale figures on a hill just watching them fight, but not involved with either side. And then they begin to hear the rumors of like what they do at nighttime. And so here, I guess, is where some of the other human kind of rumors about vampires sort of come from. I thought that was a really well written part to just get across that, oh, that's what some people do. And you can see the kind of this is another part of the sort of like debauchery basically of the Cubs and what they're doing. But then it's sort of shattered basically in a way when a Vampanese comes around. The character I don't think matters that much. He's referenced again, but like it's not like an important character that we get tons of character development with. It's just a named Vampanese who is a more established Vampanese compared to all of these kind of rookie vampires here. So this is a Randall Chain, and basically he wants to fight a member of the Cubs. And Larten is clever here. He's aware that like, oh, he should be targeting a general if that's what he wants to do. But no, he's looking for an easy kill. And so he's like, show me your leader. And they're all looking at like Tanis, expecting him to sort of step up and do something here, because he's been leading them and just making the key decisions for the group. So they expect him to make the decision here. but he's quiet. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't want to fight. And one of the other guys steps up, Zula Pone, who again, you just get quickly introduced to as like this guy they found who joined them somewhat recently. But you see that like, oh, here is someone who actually has that kind of sense of he wants to prove himself here in this fight. And it's going okay initially, but then boom, the experience just comes to fruition here, and Zula is killed pretty quickly and brutally by Randall. And so this is what basically breaks up the Cubs. Everyone in the aftermath of this pretty much realizes that that was a very dishonorable thing for Tanish to do. He exiles himself because he knows that this wasn't great. And this is when Larten and Wester actually make their decision to return to Seba. And again, I like the pacing on this. Like, there's no need to, in this case, to show their journey back to Seba and then the meeting where they re-encounter him for the first time. And I like that because they're vampires, because there's just a passage of time. In a way, because this was an agreed upon thing, we can just hop back into, once they return to him, obviously their training resumes. What is the next, like, key event that happens? And you're just being led between key moments, and you're not getting too much of the sort of like kind of almost like fillery stuff that you don't necessarily need in terms of like, oh, how do we find him? They know how to find him and stuff like that. And so this is part 2. We're into part 2 now, which is the return here, and they've been back with Seba for a while now, and they're carrying his coffin around, and basically he guides them to this kind of meeting place to meet Ivana. And so this is a very cool scene because, of course, we know like Larten has a history with Ivana. That's where the scar comes from. We get that in the book, but later on. This is their first encounter here. And we find out that basically this is not her home. This is just like a meeting point she goes to specifically have meetings with vampires. Because she's aware that both the vampires and the Vampanese both want to, get her to have a child for either side. And so they're always sort of pushing their new up-and-coming recruit to meet with her, just in case she shows interest in someone out of the blue, and this is where she makes her decision. And so Seba, it's revealed, is actually bringing Wester and Larten there to see if either of them takes her kind of fancy here. So there's a lot of fun interactions here, again, if you've read the original series and so on. And she reveals her beautiful form, of course, as well. But the main thing here is just that, like, okay, she finds Larten interesting because he's a little bit of a kind of charmer and is willing to take a slight risk with sort of how he talks to her. But the main thing that actually happens here is that it's revealed that one of Ivana's assistants is Ara, from Vampire Mountain, of course, who we met in the original series. But we find out that, oh, her origin story, she's a human here, is that she's just this girl who's an assistant to Ivana. That this is one of the things she has, is that she has a few like young girls with her who act as her like attendants, basically. And so she's here in this scene and has this scene with Larten. But then later, in the next Ivana scene later on, Ara isn't around anymore. So she obviously talks to Larten about the idea of she wants to leave eventually. And this seems to be a common trend among the assistants, is that they do eventually just leave after a certain amount of time. And it doesn't seem like Ivana particularly cares. So that's just an interesting kind of point there. But yeah, he immediately sort of shows an interest in her, and she's maybe mainly interested in him to learn more about what it is to be a vampire. And you can see that there's a little bit of kind of chemistry here, but nothing exactly kind of comes of it here, because I think Larten gets kind of drunk at this point, and that's kind of part of what happens here. But it's a nice scene. I think it's a good introduction to Ara, instead of just like, randomly meeting someone Because there was a reference in the first book to like a vampire woman with a staff wanting to challenge him, but it's not Ara then. But here is her origin story, and again, future books will explain kind of what the rest of the details with her, because of course we know she does eventually have a relationship with Larten. So that's all kind of fine here, and that's how that kind of first meeting goes, basically. And again, they do cover a little bit about the relationship between the clans at this point. You get a bit of the whole, Seba has to explain that, oh, she also goes to meet with the Vampanese, of course. She doesn't play favourites. And this annoys Wester, of course, because he has that hatred of the Vampanese. Which is interesting, like Wester throughout this book is interesting, because of course, Larten's the main character, and they highlight most of the time that, you know, Larten has the potential. He's more skilled than Wester. He's the one who has the higher potential. Everyone views him as like, he could be something. And no one really tends to look that way at Wester. And even Wester himself is 100% aware that, yeah, basically Larten is better. But you do continue in the scenes with the two of them to highlight that Wester does have this obsession with the Vampanese because of what happened in the past, and he absolutely hates them for what happened, but he is rather realistic about his own level ultimately. And this is where we do kind of like skim past like a few things, and that, like, you know, they return to Vampire Mountain after a few years, they do their trials, they pass them. They basically just describe, for Larten it was relatively easy, and with Wester, the Blooded Boars won. He got injured and so struggled through the last couple, but he did actually get through it, just to highlight the sort of difference in their skill level. And it's this point at which it's like, oh wow, Larten is really on track here. At this point he is completely set on becoming a vampire general. And this is when the next big point in the book happens. It's at this point is when we get the moment where Seba is asked to become the quartermaster. And so this is like, we're not going to be traveling around the place doing our usual sort of training. I'm going to have to stay in the mountain. And Seba is basically like, he when talking to other people, I think it's Paris, I think it is, might be Vancha, I forget exactly, but he basically says, I expect Wester to stay with me, but Larten, it's like, I'm not really sure, but he probably should decide to go off on his own and maybe take up training with someone else, because he notes that a lot of the others, like including the princes, would like to train him because they see so much potential in him. It is noted that like Paris has taken an interest in him. So this is where we get the moment of like, you know, okay, Wester makes his decision. He's going to stay here as well to continue his training. And Larten sort of reluctantly decides to do the same. And it's a sense of like, it was, Larten notes himself, this is the easy decision, but is it the best decision? And Seba can sort of see the potential in Larten to kind of have a similar thing to what happened at the end of the previous book happen again. And so, you know, the training continues. It gets harder and harder at this point because more pressure is placed on Larten as one of the people with high potential. And we saw this happen in the previous book as well, that like Larten kind of is struggling with that idea that he is super skilled and that people expect a lot of him. And in a way, in response to that, his decision is almost to like lean away from it. So I think that's an interesting kind of part of him, and that like he's being trained by this character who is really aware that like, I don't want to be ambitious. That's sort of like Seba, of like, what will someone do with power? Even if it looks on the outside before they have power like they'd be good with it, you don't know how they're going to be with it. And that's why Seba has always stayed away from a position of power, noting that the position of quartermaster is probably the best thing for him, where he can kind of have an influence on things because he's there in Vampire Mountain at all times and can be someone who talks to like all the princes. That's the type of power that good for him. And I suppose the idea is ultimately that Larten is going to follow in those footsteps, but he also does absolutely have the potential to become a prince at some point. But does he have the will to, train that hard to get to that level? And I think it's in around this point that we get the kind of contrast in a way between Seba and Larten to Mika, who wants to be a prince, and he's laser focused on that. He wins the howling competition and is just like, I want to become a prince as soon as possible. And that's not who Larten is. And you see all these little moments that he kind of encounters that help to kind of push him in a different direction. And so there's this moment here at the end of, I think this is like, what, part 3 is it? When Larten and some others are asked to basically clear out a mass of bodies, like corpses, that have been piled up in the river in the Hall of the Voyages, and it's related to, of course, the Guardians of the blood and stuff like that. And it's a pretty brutal scene where, like, of course, this is this really kind of symbolic and important thing in vampire culture, is in a way to be sent off the kind of waterfall of Vampire Mountain and go on that final voyage. And so them having to sort of clean out the kind of bones of people who didn't go over the mountain, it's off the side of the mountain. It's a bit of this kind of situation of like, oh, if I just stay here training for years and years and years in the mountain, is this just where I'm destined for, to be a pile of bones that's blocking the river, basically, having not really done anything, just live in the mountain, die in the mountain, and that's it. I'm just there to be cleaned out at the end. And this is what makes him realize that, oh, like, there's so much else I also want to do with my life. And again, it's a similar thing to the thing with the Cubs, but it is slightly different overall. So that's kind of interesting. And at this point, he decides that he is going to leave. And you do get another quite kind of heated kind of moment here, where he's not just leaving temporarily. He has committed at this point to, I'm leaving for good. I don't want to be a general anymore or anything. I don't know if I'm going to come back or not. And kind of Seba has to accept that this is the right approach. And this time Wester does actually stay behind as well, because he has decided on his path. He wants to be a guard. He's not going to be a general anymore. He doesn't feel he's good enough, but he wants to be a guard. And everyone assumes that Wester will be the one who follows in Seba's footsteps to become the quartermaster. And so we get Larten on his own once again, going into the kind of final stages of this book. And this is obviously, they describe, this is a much more confused Larten than the one at the end of the first book, because they describe that he tries a bit of everything. Like, he goes back to the Cubs and like it's worse than ever in a way, but it's just not for him. That isn't what he wants to do anymore. That style of living, that's not it. That's not the right thing for him. They describe that like he goes back to the Cirque du Freak for a little bit and he likes it, but it's not what he needs right now. And this is when he encounters Vansha just kind of out in the field. And so they kind of team up for Vansha's mission, which is to track down Arrow, who we know eventually becomes a prince, but right now he is not a prince. He's abandoned the clan for some reason, and everyone wants to know why. Now, again, it doesn't take too long to do this. They don't spend ages tracking him down, finding out where he is. They quickly just locate him, and the reveal here is, of course, that Arrow has married a human woman. And this is a kind of notable point, because in a way, like, this feels like part of the answer for kind of Mr. Crepsley about what exactly it is that he maybe wants. And that is that, okay, as a cub, he did everything he wanted to do, but it didn't come across like he ever really had like a true romance or like a connection to someone. And maybe this is suggesting that, kind of like Arrow, maybe this is kind of what he needs to do. And so it's interesting to get this perspective where we just have this conversation at the dinner table of Arrow's perspective on things, his wife's perspective on things as well. She doesn't want to be blooded. She can accept the fact that she will die before he does, that they can't have kids, but that this is an important dynamic for the two of them. And it in a way just opens a slight extra door of like, oh, this is something that is potentially possible overall. So, you know, they kind of just give him the usual thing of like, we kind of frown upon this sort of thing, but it doesn't seem like you have inherently like abandoned the clan or anything like that. So, you know, it is what it is, basically. Return to us kind of if you need to. He doesn't get punished for what happens here, of course. And, you know, after a while running around with Vancha, this is where he actually decides to, one of the things with Ivana from the first scene was that she only gives her like location of where she actually like lives to people she actually shows an interest in, and she does give it to Larten. So here's where he finally uses that and actually goes to where she lives. And so this is where you get the whole stuff with the kind of frogs and stuff like that. But interestingly, there's a new aide this time out, a girl named Melora. And obviously we find out Ara isn't here anymore. And again, it's a nice scene with Ivana where they discuss a few things that, like, you know, we know we kind of expect them to discuss. But the core point here, this is where you get the scene of Larten getting the scar, which is that he gets drunk, he asks her to transform into her beautiful form, and when she does, he attempts to kiss her. She slashes at him, gives him the scar, and he immediately runs, like completely runs. And what's interesting about it is that Ivana is kind of like, okay, I acted quite intensely there, but she was going to chase him down to sort of like, you know, calm things down. She wasn't like wildly annoyed, because I think she was understanding of like that he was drunk and that's part of why it happened. And I think Melora gives her perspective on it later as just like, she Ivana will understand that this was more out of like kind of drunkenness and kind of stupidity and innocence, rather than you know, forcing yourself kind of onto her, like, type thing. And so this is where he leaves. He thinks she's like she's coming after him to kill him, and he's done something absolutely terrible. But on the way out, he encounters Melora. And this is interesting because she had said previously, and this is where you get that perspective of like, oh yeah, all of the aides typically at some point leave because they don't particularly like serving Ivana. And she uses this as their opportunity to leave. And so she's just like, I'll go with you. You're leaving. I'll follow you, basically. And this is where he temporarily gets this assistant. Now, she says straight away, she does not want to become a vampire. So for her, that's not even on the table. She just wants to get out of here and, you know, find her way. And, you know, she says that like, oh, I'll find some place and I'll leave you at a certain point. But it seems like she sticks around with him for quite a while here. There is a meeting with Paris. Paris and Larten encounter each other at a certain point. This is a very interesting scene because we get Bram Stoker introduced here, of course, which is kind of fun. And what happens here is that he knows Paris, and they talk about it. Bram knows that Paris is a vampire, and so is writing a book, of course. But he asks Larten stuff about vampires, and Larten's just like, oh yeah, here's all the information you need. You know Paris, I can be open. And Paris is just like, Larten, don't tell him anything. He wants to write like the truth of the vampires in his books. But he eventually basically threatens Bram into being like, okay, we can accept it. You're going to write a book about vampires, but you're going to make it very fantastical and lean into some of those kind of rumored kind of ideas about this is how you deal with vampires. So people don't actually know what vampires are actually like. So leave out all the details that people don't always talk about. So generals, princes, that sort of thing. But include all the weird stuff about garlic and crosses and so on. So that's where that's a cool connection to the whole, like, what humans actually know about vampires and so on. It's kind of cool. It is around this time where it is noted that Larten has basically the kind of vampire flu, and it's noted to be a quite debilitating kind of illness in this case. That vampires can brush off illnesses for the most part. So if a vampire gets the vampire flu, they really get taken out by this. And Larten's dealing with it okay, especially because he has kind of Melora there to kind of help him. But it gets worse and worse and worse. And so as you go into the last stage of the book, Larten's basically delirious. And because he is kind of leading them around the world, he's making the decisions. And even though, like, Melora has that aspect of just like, I'm the boss in this situation, she obviously can't fully control whatever Larten is doing. So he makes the decision. They're going on a boat. They're going to Greenland, and they're using this exact ship. So it's the Pearly Tornado. They join this. They give a bunch of money. They meet up with the crew. And basically, as we go through this, you find out that Larten is just really, really sick. Like, he's not doing much on the boat. And for the most of the time here, it is Melora just sort of looking after him, keeping him safe. She is letting him drink from her, so he has blood. But it's because he's also dealing with an illness, he needs more blood. So on their way, they stop off at a few places, and she is forced to actually go out and basically take blood from people who are like asleep on the streets, like drunk and stuff like that. And one of the kind of young members of the crew, Daniel Abrams, notices that she does this. And this is sort of the key point that sort of starts the kind of craziness here, because everything's going okay until he sees that this is the case. And this begins to kind of start this kind of the path, because okay, the next thing that happens is that Larten kind of loses himself a little bit and actually begins to just full on feed from people, like more or less kind of like attack them and feed from them. Melora comes in, tries to stop this, but because Daniel had seen what Melora was doing, he kind of connects the dots together, and it's just kind of like, vampire, like, you are drinking blood right now. She was taking vials of blood to give to you, to kind of care for you. And so the crew just immediately kind of like turns on them, and Larten has like a turn with his illness, so he's certainly really weak. And we just get this thing where, like, out of almost nowhere, the book just goes incredibly dark, where Melora steps up and is just like, I am defending Larten with my life. And she's just killed by the rest of the crew because of the reveal that Larten is a vampire. And it just happens really suddenly, not too long after, like a little bit earlier on, while he's still like there basically and hasn't lost his mind to the illness. She does reveal that the reason she follows him around and isn't like making any decisions to go off on her own is because she has fallen for him and is in love with him. And of course he's like, what, you're a child, but she's just completely devoted to him at this point. So it's this kind of, for her character, it's like a cool thing to see her be like so strong, stand up for Larten, but it's also brutal that the crew turns so kind of like heavily on them. And I suppose just to make it worse, like, you have like Larten wakes up, has no clue what has just happened, and as he walks out onto the deck and finds out that, like, oh, where is Melora? And then he realizes what's happened. It's revealed they've kind of like hung her up by her neck, and it's like, it's, again, incredibly dark scene that part of it is meant to be like, okay, it's this really brutal scene where obviously Larten has made mistakes here, done things wrong in sort of his decision making, but the crew has also maybe not handled themselves the best here in terms of what they did to her. And so Larten has this kind of moment where he kind of snaps and kills most of the crew, leaving just a few people alive, including a baby boy that is also on board. And this is a really, really cool connection, because obviously the reveal of who this character is doesn't happen here. But one interesting, like fascinating connection that does happen is Daniel Abrams. You can sort of make the connection at this point, because as they make their way, like, he realizes that he saved one of the kind of more experienced crew members to kind of guide the boat to actually get them to Greenland. So when they arrive there, more or less, when he goes back into where he's holding the rest of the crew so they don't like attack him again, it's revealed that Daniel has sort of like lost his mind, turned into a cannibal, and has kind of like begun to eat the other members of the crew. And so he's kind of like, you see, I'm like you, I drink blood and all this stuff, but it's pure kind of cannibalism. And so the connection here is back to book 10 from the saga of Darren Shan, The Lake of Souls. There's a character there named Spitz Abrams, who is also revealed over the course of that book to be a cannibal. And so that is the connection. Daniel Abrams is Spitz Abrams. And so Mr. Crepsley was the one who effectively had a hand in making this sort of crazy character that Darren then goes on to interact with in that series. It's probably one of the better connections in terms of, it was a kind of weird thing that happened in book 10, and here's this kind of extreme connection back into this one, and it's a little bit of a kind of subtle one in terms of like if you remember that is in fact the name and stuff like that, but it's an amazing connection that is really cool to kind of actually note. But Larten makes the decision to take the baby boy, leave the ship, and so the book ends with Larten having just lost his assistant in this kind of crazy situation. He's like just gotten over his sickness. He's now in charge of this baby boy, and he's just left a ship that now has a kind of cannibal on it. So crazy situation for him, having to take care of this boy. And again, you kind of wonder, like, how's he going to like feel in terms of the emotional exploration of the loss of Melora, and is the baby going to sort of like almost like take the place of that, him trying to maybe redeem himself for what happened to her with the baby boy, and so on. But interesting still. And then if you have been paying a lot of attention, you'll know, okay, Greenland, that's where they are. Greenland was mentioned in the first book because it's where that vampire, what's it, Perta Graal, I think it is, if I remember correctly. He was said to have come out to Greenland and had some crazy ice palace or something like that. And what's the third book called? Palace of the Damned, of course. So you get the connection of like what's kind of going to happen, but how exactly it all happens, you're not quite sure about. So interesting stuff. Perhaps you would say with this one, a little bit disjointed, just because it skips around like so much that you don't get to stay with anything for like that long in this book. But as far as I remember, the books after this, they still cover time, but I think they do cover things in a little bit more detail from what I remember. So it's just, this is the book that has to do a lot of the kind of short skipping around overall. So yeah, I think that's pretty much most of what I want to say about this one. There's maybe a little bit to criticize here, just with regards to kind of the format of this one. But I do like the character development of just showing you that this 60, 70-year-old Larten is still struggling with what sort of a vampire he wants to be. And now suddenly this crazy incident has happened to him completely on his own, and like theoretically no one knows where he is. How does he get out of this, and how will this change him going forward to sort of you know, eventually get him back to Seba on track, because I think we know he eventually does become a vampire general at some point, and all these other kind of points as well. So lots of interesting stuff. I think the only thing I maybe left out in the middle of all of that was that in the stuff in Vampire Mountain, it is revealed that Wester has like these kind of like group meetings with other people who also hate the Vampanese, and tries to get Larten involved, but of course he doesn't lean into full-on hatred of the Vampanese like Wester does, and so he does sort of just leave Wester to deal with that. But interestingly, they don't put up too many like red flags about Wester's behavior at this point, and stuff going wrong with him, and in fact are like, he's the one who's already found his direction. So that's interesting. But yeah, in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on this book, and yeah, we'll be back next week with book 3, Palace of the Damned. So that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.